Hey, hello everyone. Let's move on. In the last session, we have discussed that how to maximize utility. We have a utility function that including the consumption of two different goods, X and Y, right? In order to maximize utility, remember that we have mentioned about we needed to make sure that the marginal utility per dollar for the two goods are equal. Mathematical way, you see that this is the marginal utility of good one that divided by its price, and then it must be equal to the marginal utility of the good two over its price. So also we call this we call it a band per buck. So although that I simplify this, just give you the result, skip the detailed calculation. Today that I'm gonna continue the discussion. So make sure that we understand if we have the the changes in income, that means that our budget constraint changed, right? And then also if the price changed, how will this affect the consumption choice? So before we doing that, I want to remind you that first of all, I want you to still remember this is like a good X and then good Y or 1 or 2, whatever, right? And then we have curve is the, a 3-dimension, like a mountain shape utility function, which projected, which is projecting on the 2D dimension, all right? And then what is that, remember we have mentioned about the budget constraint. Budget constraint is that how we can allocate our money, on those two goods based upon their, let's say that the price, right? And then usually we will draw a kind of a straight line like this. So since this is like a tangent point, if we have a low income or low budget constraint, then we probably end up here. But if we have a higher, let's say higher budget constraint, the straight line, that we probably here. So that tangent point is the point we just mentioned about the maximizing the utility. Okay, so this is more like you take it as given. All right, no discussion. I try not to make this this explanation more complicated. Finding these points based upon the different budget constraint, and then that we start our discussion regarding the income, price, or preference change. Okay, so we know that the utility function is more like a given function. All right, so it's a mountain shape, but we don't care about that. The first thing is that how we have the the budget constraint change. The budget constraint change or income change is more like a shifting outward, right? It's increase of income. It can be also like the price change of one goods. This is also about the it's not the shifting, it's a rotating of this budget constraint line. Okay, so it's about the straight line. So in this case, the indifference curve is more like a fixed, it's given, but we are changed the budget constraint line, which is the straight line in this case. And then this is the first example is like we are consuming the concert ticket and then overnight stay, whatever. So this is not important. I try not to use very specific products or goods. Just imagine that we have two goods and how we can spend our money on those. If we have a low income or budget constraint, our budget constraint line is around here. And then if we have if we are simply speaking that if we calculate that this 20 is the quantity times the price, or like say that we can choose we have the 5 is the quantity for the overnight stay and then times the price, we will have our budget, the total budget, right? And then it is just assume that we spend all our money on one product instead of allocates between two, so that we can simply draw this line. Okay, so but in this case that if we have a budget increase, that means that we have more money. Okay, and then that means that we can instead, it's doubled. So instead of we buy, let's say 20 tickets, I don't know why they buy 20 tickets, but in this case that we can buy 40 tickets. Okay, and then we can stay 10 nights, and then that we can draw this budget constraint line. I mean, this is more like a shifting up outward, right? And then we will find our, remember that our difference curve is different. The indifference curve is like a, like a parallel, let's say, curve. So in this case, very likely that if we start from that, if we start from the, the point M, if M is the first, let's say that the tangent, this is the curve. We have a tangent line. And then we will have, end up with N. I mean, just give you the concrete example that we have the indifference curve and then the tangent point M and N. This is the maximizing, utility point that we are trying to define this M or this N. Based upon what criteria? Remember that the marginal utility per dollar is equal for those between those two goods. All right, just try to keep it simple. So the first one is we called that in this case, the shifting of the budget constraint, we call this the income effect. In this case, that we know that the two goods are all, let's say that the normal goods. The reason is simple because if we compare M and N, you can see that the both side increased the quantity, right? And then here it gives us a hint, like the, this example is not good, but they said overnight stay is inferior goods. Although it makes no sense at all, but it's just imagine if it is it is inferior goods. That means if our income increase, the quantity demand or quantity consumed should be decreased. But this apparently it's not the case, right? So we know that the ticket and then the stay are all, let's say that the normal goods. The quantity demanded or quantity consumed is increased with the income increase. We are talking about another thing is regarding the price change. So in this case, that it use a different thing that the camera stays the same price, but the baseball bat, this is more like a increase the price. So if the price of bait rises and then the budget constraint rotated inward, why inward, not outward? I use a very simple way to tell you. If we have the same budget constraint, if we have the same money or the same income, like we can buy this much. Also, I don't know because it didn't give us any quantity, right? So we can, for example, this is 20. Just assume this is 20. If I spend all my money, I can buy 20 bats. Okay, but in this case, that because the price increased, and then if I spend all my money on this bat, I can only buy 15, right? The price increase, the bat's price increase, and then I have to, but if I spend all my money on camera, it doesn't change, right? It just stay the same. So I don't need to change this. And then you see that if the price of the baseball bats increase or rises, and then this is rotate inwards. That's the idea. Very likely we have, although we don't draw this indifference curve, all right? But in this case, that very likely the indifference curve is like this. It's because it's telling us like M is the maximizing or the optimized point. If I assume J is the the optimized point, I can draw another indifference curve, something like that. Okay, although not good, but you just imagine that this is assume. First of all, assume those, let's say that the camera and the baseball bats are both normal goods, and then this is more like shifting all inward. Why? Because that although we are talking about the price effects, right? But usually price of the price effects, it's including the income effects, and then we call the income effects, and then the substitution effects. Keep it simple because the price change, the baseball bats price increase, that also means that our income somehow like it's equivalent to income decrease because we can buy less baseball bats. Okay, I will discuss that a little bit further later. Possible choice would be fewer baseball bats and then more camera. Okay, so this is on the point's edge, right? This is possible because it depends on how we draw our indifference curve. Actually, I don't know, right? So it doesn't give us any details. If the indifference curve is like that, the edge can be the optimized point, but it can be also like the J I just mentioned, or let's say K or L. It really depends on how this indifference curve look like, and then where is the tangent point. Discussion gives very few information, so I just can tell you like first of all, this is the budget line is rotating inward. The second thing is that the indifference, we have different indifference curve, right? And then the tangent point, the budget line tangent with the indifference curve is the optimized optimized point, which is also stands for the utility maximizing point. Essentially, we want to maximize our utility based upon our budget constraint. It doesn't matter price, right? Price can change, incomes can change, but we just want to find the optimized point, which is the tangent point on the budget line and then the indifference curve. All right, let's move on. If we have a higher price, let me tell you that this is the one that this is, let's say that we have mentioned if we have a price change, and then that we are facing two effects, let's say the two effects actually combine. We start at let's say that the point F, okay? But if we have the price increase, and then remember that is this budget line, budget constraint rotated inward, okay? So this from D to, which is that? To D to B, okay? From D point to B point. And then as you can see that first of all, that we have so-called the income effects. I mean, it really doesn't matter the substitute effects first or the income effects first. But in this case, let me tell you first is the income effects, because if I draw a line, if I draw a parallel line, meaning that we are more like having, treat that the price increase similar to the income decrease. And then we just, this line is actually the line of LGZ. This is the line I just created. We end up shifting this line, and then we end up with G, okay? But this G is, it stands for what? This stands for the income effects. The income effects moving from point F to G, all right? And then that's the substitution effects. Why? Because the price changed. Equal marginal utility per dollar, this is not hold anymore, right? So in order to hold that, I have to consume more. This is more like the camera, but the less baseball bats, right? To make sure that this the band per buck equal between those two goods. This is we call this substitution effects, moving from G to E. But this won't change of our utility. It's substitution because it's more like we are along this utility curve. And then you see that end up with from G to E, this is the substitution effect. And then E is the new optimized point. Why? Because you see this is the line, the new line, right? Because we have the price changed and then the budget constraint shifted. But honestly speaking, usually you only see 2 points, F and then E. But let me tell you, because of these two effects, and then usually it goes from the F to G and from the G to E for the two effects I just mentioned, the substitute effects and the income effect. I don't think I needed to explain you what is the substitution or what is the income anymore, right? This is more like a very detailed explanation on how the price change or how this higher price will end up with the change of the quantity between those two goods. Because of this, the price increase, and then we have lowered our utility. The indifference curve, stands for different level of utility, right? And then the second thing is we are moving towards consuming more camera and then less baseball bat. Usually you will see like this is, we use the generic goods XLY. I mean, it's pretty, let's say that the theoretical, or let's say that use those mathematical approach. But anyway, so for me, this is a very important idea you needed to understand. Let's move on. Remember that we talk about the demand and supply, but now like we are kind of detached demand and supply. But in this case, we are more like focused on the individual, how individual will come up with their own consumption decision. how we can link our, consumer theory or this, that the utility maximization of individuals with the demand. As you can see this, if we use the good X as an example, if the price change, price increase, and then we will have this, budget constraint line shift inward, right? And then we end up with consume different quantity of good X. Along with the price increase, we consume less from 90 to 65 to 50. And then we know the price, okay, because we know the price is increased. And then we also know that the consumption decision, which is the quantity. And then you see, we can already draw these 3 points, okay, in a different diagram, or let's say in a demand individual. This is not the market, but this is the individual, diagram, right? The individual demand curve. In this way that we can find it, I mean, theoretically speaking, if we can find each individuals and then we put it together or accumulate, add it together, we will find our market demand. You can take a quick look on this. This is giving you that exactly the same, explanation, but also I don't like the example. We have like a price increase and then we have the quantity changed, and then M0, M1, M2, M3, and then we can already how to say that, locate those points together. And then once we add up, if I use this diagram, let me tell you what I will do. It really doesn't matter which, it is a straight line or this curve, person A, and then we will have person B, person C. I just made it up, right? And then person 4. So this will, once we add up this, we will have a very big, we call aggregate, or we call for the market demand. This is the individual demand, but we can end up, we add everything together, add all the consumer together, we have the market demand. We use this for the demand and the supply, or the equilibrium analysis. But this is a pretty complicated, let's say that concept, but you have to know that how we come up with our demand curve. So although usually we just go ahead to draw the market demand curve, but that's the idea. And especially this is down to the individual consumption, or let's say that the individual utility maximization. Usually in economics that we call this self-interest. Okay, so everyone wants to maximize their utility. And then once we have defined each person or each individual's utility function, and then that we can draw this indifference curve, we can find their budget constraint, we can maximize, I mean, theoretically, we can draw their individual demand curve using this approach, right? And then we add up. So the whole idea behind that is, it's more like from individual to the market level. But for me, that I would more stay with the individual utility. Remember that I have mentioned to you, if we are making decisions, I recommend you to use a utility maximization approach. What does that mean? I mean, it doesn't really apply to goods, but it can be any decision you make. Try to come up with your own utility function, put many factors, many elements into consideration, and then choose the one with the higher utility. Actually, this is a principal level microeconomics, so I already talked too much, but honestly speaking, that this utility is very, very important. I will mention that in the following session. A few slides talk about that the behavioral economics. So we have discussed our utility, we have discussed about maximizing utility. This is all based upon the assumption that the people are, let's say, rational, okay? So because we are making decisions, or let's say we are making consistent and informed decisions to maximize our utility, there will be something that, we have to consider, like the behavioral aspect. This behavioral economics is not integrated into the previous or the traditional economic discussion. You can treat this as a, like a new, let's say, field, how their behavior to, let's say that affect that decision making. Okay, so this is about the traditional. All right, so this makes people. This is talk about the people are all, let's say that the rational. They are all, let's say, they can be, self-controlled. Everyone is the same, but the reality is not true, right? Because we call the preference heterogeneity. Although this is more like a fancy word, but in that case that, people, they have different state of mind, or they have very different psychological consideration, whatever. So this is like, we have to take that into consideration. Generally speaking, people have different preference. This is the first thing, okay? So people have different preference. They might make the decision differently, all right? And then they might have different perception, and then they will make the decision differently. And then also in this case, that this behavioral economics is more like focused on that the psychological, or let's say that to integrate the psychological perspective into economic analysis. And then that if you really have some, let's say that the interest, we can talk about that, because my research is focused on the consumer preference, or we call that the consumer economics, okay? Consumer behavior. All right, see you next time.